We're going to get started again here. I'm Stefan Lorenzado. I'm one of the planning team for the conference. It's my pleasure to introduce the next panel to you. We're going to have a couple speakers, and then we're going to bring a couple other people up to answer questions. So we're going to have two talks of about 20 minutes apiece. We'll hold questions from those until both speakers are done, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So the first person speaking is Colin Bailey from the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water. They're headquartered out of Sacramento, or at least he is. And he's been working throughout the state with disadvantaged communities, trying to preserve their access to water, the quality of water that they get, and how water is used in their communities. So with that, I'll leave it to Colin to round out the introduction.
Thanks very much, Stefan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to share some of the work that we are in fact partnered in doing. Again, my name is Colin Bailey. I'm the Executive Director and Managing Attorney of the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, otherwise known as EJCW. And I'm joined by our colleague Mark Commendatore, also with the Department of Water Resources, who is a partner on this, as are several in the community, several in the audience whom you will meet shortly. By way of introduction, since I don't know who all is in the room, how many of you, I've seen some stunning photos of work being done for fish and birds. How many of you consider your work to be part of the environmental justice movement? By show of hands. All right, good number. I hope to hear from you all later. We're going to talk about how this is really part and parcel of the work. So just by way of introduction, as a statewide organization, water in California is very complex. A colleague from the Pacific Institute was quoted in the paper as saying, water in California is way more complicated than rocket science. He is actually not a rocket scientist, nor am I, but point well taken. We can, in the very same year, have record-breaking drought, as well as record-breaking flood, both of which fall disproportionately on low-income communities of color. Not least of reason which is it incurs voracious appetite for the water that does remain. Here's a photo out of the California San Joaquin Valley, where water levels dropped precipitously during the drought, leaving many a farm worker community and others to self-help means, having, in this instance in Seville, having to go 30 miles to an adjacent community to pull water into buckets with which to live. Impacts on water quality, obviously impacts on fish. The San Francisco Bay Delta is facing an extraordinary strain at the moment and possible multiple species extinctions. We have more nitrogen and more nutrients in the riparian corridors with impacts on water quality and the cost of cleaning it up. Here in the Bay Area, we have, or just down the road in the Bay Area, I should say, we have sea level rise, which is creating a great strain on infrastructure because of the legacy of racial segregation, which I will discuss momentarily. That has many low-income communities of color deliberately placed in harm's way, where the levees weren't yet built and the infrastructure was not there to protect people. We have in the upper watershed 60+ million trees that are tinder for extraordinary fires, inviting little creatures like this guy in. My sister actually just moved 3 weeks ago to just west of Santa Rosa, so we are watching these fires with great interest, leaving what have been soils that are 20,000 years in the making. No longer is fire a rejuvenative practice, but it is scouring the landscape, leaving nothing behind it, so that that great soil is sloughing off into the creeks, and folks like Andy from the Placer County Water Authority are telling me they're spending tens of millions of dollars now to just clean up the gummed up works. So in that context, EJCW seeks to educate and empower and nurture a community-based coalition that serves as a public voice and effective advocate for environmental justice issues in California water policy. Our vision is that all communities in California have access to safe, clean, affordable water, clean rivers, streams, etc., for personal, cultural, ceremonial, subsistence, and recreational uses. We've got a long list of activities. Our activities are as diverse as our coalition includes everything from building grassroots leadership to take charge of the environmental justice campaigns that we address, to full gauge litigation, as well as regional planning and project development, one component of which we're going to talk to you about today. A lot of that work, as you can see in this instance, relates to water quality, and it's just one example of some of the work that we've done. We adopted in 2007 a human rights approach to the human right to water, led by many a colleague in here, including Bern Goering. I'll skip the video, but communities rallied all over the state, and I'm happy to report that after a 5.5-year campaign in 2012, California became the first state in the nation to, by legislative means, adopt a human right to water policy that states that every human has a right to safe, clean, affordable water for cooking, drinking, and sanitation. Of course, laws don't implement themselves, so we are still very much in the throes of what that means, but we've made some extraordinary good strides. We also think that this is an environmental justice issue as it relates to water. And before I go on with some of the slides, I'm going to give you a little bit of history here. So what you see in the background here is the Avondale Glen Elder neighborhood. This neighborhood was formed in 1953. Its formation, and I give you this history because it is emblematic of a regional planning process that embraced the idea of formal racial apartheid. It is unusual in its response, however. So through 1947, I assume most of you are familiar with this history, communities were largely segregated throughout the entire country by race, by class, and that was undertaken through a legal mechanism called racially restrictive covenants. My own deed in my own home has a clause that is, of course, inoperative by law that says that no person of non-white ancestry may own this home. That was used to literally put people into low opportunity and high opportunity communities. This was one of those low opportunity communities. But it had a twist to it. About the same time as redlining was becoming the main practice for continuing segregation following the US Supreme Court's ruling banning that practice as a tool, there was a civil rights attorney in Sacramento who, much like test cases before, like Plessy versus Ferguson, et cetera, brought a test case. And so in the court case, Ming versus Horgan, they specifically challenged the Federal Housing Administration's redlining practices as specifically discriminating against this community. What made this community unusual and particularly sympathetic is that you literally had African-American rocket scientists who had moved from the South, highly educated, working for the military-industrial complex at Mather Air Force Base, at McClellan, and right here in its backyard at the Power Inn Depot, then called the Army Depot, who could not buy a home because they were unsubsidized. As a result of that 1953 court case, there was a settlement which made this neighborhood, Avondale Glen Elder, the first, quote unquote, integrated community in the Sacramento region. Overnight, it flipped and became what was primarily a kind of a quasi-agrarian, unincorporated community to a densely populated African-American community, almost 100% African-American, with a high rate of home ownership. Subsequent to that, as soon as that dynamic flipped, the county in which it resided, Sacramento County, abandoned plans to pave the roads, to put in sidewalks, to put in street lights, and people had to fight for those things. On the flip side, that newly African-American community was adjacent to the white officers' community. And instead of putting in sidewalks, the county actually made a proposal to put in, and I kid you not, in 1962, a racial apartheid wall. They actually wanted to erect a physical structure. Now, roads have done that same work. Highway 99 was in fact put in as a physical barrier between Black and Brown Oak Park and Curtis Park, where I live. This type of structure was also a barrier. So you had, excuse me, in many ways, the fates of communities were being poured literally in concrete. And I submit to you, this is one of those structures, and the topic of today's discussion is really how we flip that script. So, we're going to talk to you a little bit about Morrison Creek. This is Morrison Creek, and in fact, I think, Mark, you took this photo sometime in, I want to say, February or March in the wettest year on record. So this is the high water mark, no pun intended. So what did we do? Mark wanted me to tell you a little bit about how this idea came into being. And that has a little bit to do with my history with this particular neighborhood. So just by way of telling that story, my background is, as you can tell, an attorney. I worked for an anti-poverty nonprofit firm here in Sacramento, just up the road. And in that context, did everything from public benefits, affordable housing development, anti-discrimination in housing and in employment law, et cetera, et cetera. I also worked, just because the practice of the day was community lawyering and we had to be in relationship with our client communities, I got a phone call one day from one of the residents in this community in summer of 2007, it's been 10 years, and she said, there's a meeting happening tonight. It has something to do with natural gas and storing it in our community. We don't know what that means, but we think we might need representation. So I took my intern from UC Davis, and we showed up, and we started building relationships and finding out what this was. Long story short, it turned out to be a potentially highly dangerous plan to put in an underground natural gas storage facility that would store almost 8 billion, with a B, cubic feet of natural gas, largely for the purpose of hedging against the market, so that you would have a cheap supply when you needed it for peak market, et cetera. Point being, this was the first in the country that had ever been proposed in any urban setting and posed a tremendous risk, and it was not lost on us from an environmental justice perspective that was in a low-income community of color that by its very design was designed as racialized space. So the community, having organized for sidewalks, streetlights, and against an apartheid wall, presented 60 and 70-year-old African-American women who were the most seasoned veterans of the civil rights movement you have ever seen. They were extraordinary. And towards the end of that, what would become a 5.5-year campaign, which I'm proud to say that we won in Hollywood-esque storybook fashion. In fact, I had the nerve to tell Aaron Brockovich that our story was better. I'll write it someday. But when Naila, whom you see there on the far left, she joined that campaign at the very end, and she's the eldest daughter of one of our lead organizers on that natural gas storage campaign. She was clearly a leader in the making. So she became the neighborhood association chair, and it was in that, having developed that relationship, that I invited her and another young African-American woman who was also a friend and head of another adjacent neighborhood association. I said, you guys have a lot to talk about. We got to get together. And among the things that I posed to Naila was, I said, I'm no longer an attorney in my legal aid capacity, but I'm heading this new organization, this was like 5 years ago, that's working on environmental justice in water. You should check out Morrison Creek. I think there's a lot going on. And that was kind of the very nugget of how what would then become a really robust project team, which I'll share with you. So this is a picture from our very first meeting together, and you may recognize some of the people in there. Greg was there. Oops, that's not gonna work. There we go. So as of today, here's our project team. We've got the Avondale Glen Elder Neighborhood Association. We've got my organization, EJCW. We've got the Sacramento Creeks, sorry, that should be plural, Council. Walk Sacramento, and I'll describe some of the groups here. Walk Sacramento works on healthy, walkable communities. Sacramento Housing Alliance, which is an affordable housing advocacy group. CBEC Inc., which is Chris Bowles and his team, which do really great riparian, they don't call it restoration, but they call it revitalization, I think was the term he used. And that's an academic point he can make with you later. Valley Foothills Watershed Collaborative with Greg back there. We've got our colleagues from the California Department of Water Resources, and then great support from a really interesting cast of funders, including Kaiser Permanente, which sees in this an opportunity to restructure the relationship of the community to its environment in a way that can build health. We've got the California Endowment, which has among its dozen or so community investment programs a Building Healthy Communities Collaborative in South Sacramento in this very neighborhood. And the last two recently, with Christine's help here, the National Park Service is actually going to lend in-kind support to the community visioning phase, which in some ways will bring the national parks approach to Morrison Creek, and Wells Fargo Foundation, whom they don't know it yet, but we're going to ask them to start looking at purchasing some properties for what we hope will be some affordable housing developments right next door. So there's our good colleague Stefan. We were all hopping the fence and trying to figure out what's going on. I've actually got a series of photos here. Let me get this right here. And you can see this is a traditional, what is it, bother? Trapezoidal, uninspired flood irrigation ditch. You can tell I might stumble over this language because it's not my language. But we all came to the conclusion that there was a great opportunity here. You'll see in the background here, there is a grade school immediately adjacent to the creek. There is also on the other side, if I can get that in the background, behind Naila, Zong, and Kieran there, you'll see there's one of the community's greatest assets, which is the Sim Community Center and Park. And that has been one of the places where we think this could really be a gem. So here's the park, and here are people playing baseball as one of the neighborhood's great sport events. We've conducted community outreach in this particular setting, trying to get folks involved in identifying what they can contribute to the project and its vision. Is that my time? This is also contextualized as part of a multi-benefit project. Here you'll see Naila and our colleagues doing a walk audit. So the idea is to connect Morrison Creek. I think, Mark, you're going to have a better map than I, but you're going to see that this particular creek potentially connects Power Inn Road, which is a pedestrian unfriendly road, to 65th Expressway, which is yet another pedestrian unfriendly road, but both are the only places where people can catch a bus to any of the places that they need to go, including in this particular community. It's a food desert, so it takes a trek to get to food, with the exception of there is a community garden that is just half a block away from Morrison Creek. So the hope is, and we've been speaking with some of the farmers there, to integrate their collective action on food justice and actually provide them with a forum in the creek for that produce. Connect it to the Safe Routes to Schools movement, which you can see in action here, and figuring out how we actually tie this in with some of the advocacy that the community has done around transportation justice. During the recession, it's communities like this, and in this community in particular, where the soft infrastructure, the buses, were cut immediately, leaving people stranded when needing to get to the doctor, when needing to get to a job, and the hard infrastructure, which for anybody following California's greenhouse gas reduction efforts, somehow still manages to replicate pre-existing advantage and disadvantage by putting heavy gauge infrastructure into the same communities that were once the places where racially restrictive covenants were used. Happy to elaborate on that in the future. And so you can see here our colleagues at Walk Sacramento working on the Sacramento Bicycle and Transportation Master Plan, attempting to get the city and county behind this particular project for all the great benefits it would offer to not only the community, to the community garden, to the for safe routes to schools, but also the curriculum element, integrating it with the park, and ultimately to have a community development plan around this. Now, to kind of round it off before I hand it off to Mark, among the challenges in doing this work in an urban environmental justice setting are that there are tremendous gentrification pressures on communities like this, which are adjacent to some of the bigger backbone corridors. And it just so happens that as a legacy of the land use practices that were commensurate with a racial apartheid, you can see in that bottom corner, this is where it's all warehouses, which overnight, with with the legalization of marijuana, are flipping into heavy industrial grow facilities and the secondary processing that's going to put it in your favorite candies. So the truck traffic is going to become an additional issue that will put more need for Morrison Creek to be a safe route to school. And we are in conversation with those growers who do seem to want to be good stewards and good neighbors about potentially adopting a part of the community corridor along Morrison Creek. And there seems to be some appetite for that. So there are many of you who raised your hands earlier, who said your work is environmental justice. And for those who didn't, I'd love to posit the question, what if we decided that as a rivers people, our primary goal is to help people in need and to address social and environmental justice problems? If that were our primary purpose, if we volunteered our time and our skills pro bono, if we took the time to be sensitive to the dynamics of difference, power, and privilege among people and cultural groups, and really promote the general welfare of society and the development of people, their communities, to realize that full potential. With that, I want to pass it off to Mark, and thank you very much. We'll answer some questions shortly.